Anyway, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your interest in this issue. My name's Colleen Burke. I'm president of the Local. The topic of today's session is about the staff-appointed pension plan. A couple of housekeeping things. There are some handouts at the back. 3 of them about the UPP project we've already sent out via email, but grab a hard copy if you'd like one. And they're also available through the UPP website, which you can link to from our website. The other one is the U of T pension plan booklet, just as an FYI. If you aren't familiar with the terms of our pension plan, it's in here, also available on the U of T website. Today's talk is being videotaped and will be on our website in the next week or so. So if you have colleagues who've missed it, the video, the PowerPoint slides, and the script?
I don't know about the script.
We don't know about the script. The video and the PowerPoint slides will be on the website. And over the next several months, we'll have a number of lunchtime drop-in Q&As for people to come with their pension questions, because it's a complicated topic. You're not going to learn everything, in a 90-minute meeting. So, as I said, the subject of this town hall is the proposed sector-wide university pension plan. We'll talk about its origins and describe the main features of the proposed plan. There'll be Q&A at the end of the formal part of the presentation. And so our presenter is Alex McKinnon, Research Director of USW and one of the 3 co-chairs of the UPP University Pension Plan Project. Alex has been involved in the UPP project since its inception, and he's also the chair, representing the steelworkers, the chair of the U of T Pension Committee. So just to go through the outline for today, first we're going to talk about the broader context of the UPP. So that is the prevailing economic, political, labor relations climate that we're living in, and why and how this impacts pensions, and why these conditions favor the formation of a jointly sponsored pension plan in the Ontario university sector. We'll talk about the background to the UPP, including a timeline of the steps leading up to where we are today. We'll give a summary of the main terms of the proposed UPP, which is what people really want to know, including the contribution rates, the benefit formula, and other key features of the plan. And finally, we'll address your questions. There may be both big and small questions about the project. We'll do the best that we can to answer all of them. I'm going to take notes on the questions because they may end up becoming an FAQ on our website later. If there are questions that we can't answer today, we'll get the answers back out to people. It is a project that's in progress, so we may not have answers for every question, but we will provide the information in a timely and accessible fashion. So I will now turn it over to Alex. There you go.
Thanks, and thanks for coming out on such a nice day to talk about pensions. I'm not sure, but so one of the things that we've been doing a number of these town hall sessions, and some of them we've been just doing steelworkers by themselves, and in some we've been doing the faculty and steelworkers. We're going to be doing a number of joint sessions as well later on. The unfortunate part about this is that you've got to listen to me now for the next 25 minutes, strictly about pensions. At least I got one fan in the front there. So a couple of things, and Colleen's going to switch the slides for me. So this represents, and we've got a bit of a script, so if I keep looking down to read, it's because we want to make sure is that it doesn't matter who's presenting in which campus, because I'm at Queen's tomorrow with the faculty, that we're saying the same thing to everybody. So the JSPP represents a significant, important opportunity for those in the university sector to secure their defined benefit plan for the foreseeable future against an environment that we think is, quite frankly, a little bit negative. In fact, it's quite frankly a lot negative towards defined benefit plans for broader sector workers, and especially for defined benefit plans in the post-secondary sector in particular. So what I wanted to do is actually, before we start to talk, this is kind of like ratification. Everybody wants to flip to the last page and see what I got. But there's a whole lot of reasons why we've got here. We started this, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, back in 2010. So there has been a lot of work gone into this, and there's a lot of good reasons why. And so we want you to try to understand those. So one of the things I want to do is to spend a few minutes on the broader context on which we're actually preparing and making this UPP. We call it UPP for short. That's the University Pension Plan. So one of the things is that defined benefit plans around the world are facing a lot of risks, and including here in Ontario. And there's 4 different risks that I just want to sort of briefly touch on. And those are financial, those are regulatory, they're governance and political, and these are all inherent within the defined benefit plan design, which we're located. So I think it's important to stress that there's a lot of debate going on right now, that in fact there's no one mode of delivery of pensions that sort of is less riskier than the other. What's important here is that how do we actually sort of address those risks, how do we mitigate those risks, and we think that in fact to do that, the University Pension Plan is the best way to go. So next slide. The financial and regulatory risks, so I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about that. One of the increases that we face is longevity. The fact that you quit smoking is not a good thing for pensions. You're living longer. The longer you live, the more expensive it is for pensions, the more it costs. So longevity has been a problem that we've been addressing in defined benefit plans and having to deal with. And in fact, it's throughout the Western world that we're facing that problem. And in fact, in Canada in particular, has been seeing a bunch of increases to the cost of our pension plans around longevity. And secondly, as anyone knows, if you follow the financial markets, which we do on occasion, that in the last 10 years, the long-term interest rates have dropped, and they're very low. So if you renewed your mortgage, you got a boat loan or whatever you've got, you know, the mortgage rates have been relatively low, whereas the last 40 or 50 years, they've been actually a lot higher. And so for us, we sort of expect real interest rates to sort of go in the 3 to 3.5% range. And real interest rates right now are around the 2% range. And you think that's not that much of a difference between those two? It's a huge difference in the cost of pension plans. I'll deviate from the script for a second. A 1% change in interest rates changes the cost of your pensions by about 18%. So it's a huge impact on the cost of your pension plan. So low interest rates have a big impact.
There are 2 seats at the front for anyone who's standing. Mark, if you want to come up, there's 2 empty seats at the front. And, oh, I see a few, yeah, thanks, just so people don't have to stand or sit at the back.
The reason why low interest rates, you think about this, you put money in the bank and it earns interest over a period of time, but if the interest rates are really low, you've actually got to put more money in to have the same amount at the end, and so that's the impact on pensions. We're also facing increasingly difficult financial markets. There's more and more large, sophisticated players in them. You may have seen that the teacher's pension plan just spent $5 billion today buying a company. That's bigger than your pension plan. And it becomes harder and harder to generate the returns that are required to improve the viability of these plans. And another important factor in Canada, and Ontario in particular, is there's a lot of volatility in the pension fund, pension plan investment returns. That's an important impact, especially in jurisdictions like Ontario, which imposes and still imposes solvency funding. I'll talk more about that later, but it has a huge impact on the cost of your pensions. And so it's, in fact, what it does, it drives up the cost of your pension plans. And so we got short-term interest rates that go up and down a little bit. We've got solvency funding. We've got a number of things that sort of really impact the cost of the plan. One of the things that you'll see behind you, and don't mean to scare you, but this is if you're in the private sector. Here's what's happened if you've been in a defined benefit pension plan. So if you look back sort of at this side of the chart, in the mid-70s, as many as 31%, so about a third of the people that were in the private sector were covered by defined benefit pension plans. As of 2010, this is data from Stats Canada, so it's down to 12%. In fact, that number continues to decline. So it's going down. So if you're in the private sector, the odds of being in a defined benefit plan are almost zero, or getting there. But on the flip side, if you take a look now, the next graph is actually the one that's a little bit scary. And in fact, it sort of helps us to focus about pension plans in the public sector. So in the mid-70s, about 40% of members of the public sector were in defined benefit plans. By 2010, that's now increased. So unlike the private sector, it's continued to increase. And so we now have about 2/3, and it's going up slightly, of members that are in the broader public sector that are now covered by defined benefit pension plans. So think about that. In the private sector, where they're being attacked and wiped off the face of the earth, the last place they exist is in the broader public sector. So sort of if you look at those sort of financial and political pressures, the pension landscape is changing. If you look across the country, benefits are being compromised. We know that in negotiations, how difficult it is with bargaining pensions. So their plans are either eliminating or suspending the indexing of pensions or retirement. There's been many plans that have converted from final average to career average, or worse, to defined contributions. I have seen in the university sector bargaining where one of the universities has proposed switching to a DC plan. And so it's out there. It's been a feature in the banking sector. The banks, all the major banks have all cut off all new employees now go into a defined contribution plan. And so they're attacking it everywhere. So the effect of all those changes is that when you sort of move away from the defined benefit plan, those risks are being shifted from the plan sponsor to the individual employees and to the individual retirees. I'll deviate from my script for a second, is that we do have, and I run across all the time, people that think that they can handle their money better if they invest it themselves. We see that all the time. That's not the case. And so what happens is that when you're switching to a DC plan, you as an individual, as a member, or a retiree are taking all of that risk. So the other thing that we've seen is outside of Ontario, plans are converting to sort of what they call a jointly sponsored pension plan. And this was important when we looked at all this stuff in order to sort of develop what the pension plan was that we wanted to present. And so they actually have created something called jointly sponsored pension plans in some other jurisdictions. But if you actually look at them, the government retains the entire control over the plan, and the governance structure is such that in fact labor has a very limited voice in the whole process. And then if you want to take a look sort of in the most extreme example, is that if you look at New Brunswick, so for those of us that are pension geeks and we want to look at all this stuff, if you look to New Brunswick, they have something called a shared risk model. And so in the public sector there, the government went, and everybody was covered by defined benefit plans. Shortage, they're struggling with funding. They went and they created a shared risk plan. And so they took away that right to all the defined benefits that you had earned in the past. They converted it all, and everything now is depending on the funding of the plan. Even if you're a retiree, each year you can see your pension going up or down. And that's not where we want to be. By the way, that was Bill Morneau's firm. That's the legislation that they now have at the federal level. Bill C-27 is trying to push that kind of legislation through. The other thing is that we're sort of not sort of isolated from the rest of the world. So for those of us that are in the university sector, there has been up until just recently sort of a long-running strike in the UK. And in fact, there again, the strike was specifically over the issue of governance. So they made it look like that labor had a voice in the process. In fact, they didn't. It was completely dominated by the employers over there. And then as such, we've seen in many states in the U.S., pensions have become a flashpoint to Republicans. We're about to elect one here in the province. And so if you look at, even in California, where there's the CalPERS pension plan, they just had a Supreme Court case where they thought they were entitled to a number of specific rights. Those were taken away, or the court said they don't exist. And so even the courts are starting to interfere. So now that I've given you like a lot of bad news, that in this sector, the Ontario JSPPs, so when I talk about the Ontario JSPPs, we're talking about the teachers and the HOOP and others, they're a very effective response to the problems that we face. And so that's been actually, with all those pressures, that was the triggering point for us to say, we need to find a better way to provide for pension retirement security for university sector workers in the long run. And so if we're looking at the Ontario JSPPs, they have joint governance that's anchored in the collective bargaining relationships, which we're going to talk about later in the presentation. And suffice to say that there's no third parties that have control over the future of the pension plan. It's an effective and functional distinction between sponsorship and administration. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. So it's not only sort of like in your collective agreement, what I get on the last page, it's what all the language is that's in your collective agreement that's really important. This stuff is really important, what the governance is, what the sponsor board is, what the administration board is, extremely important. Like I said, there's economies of scale in those, and investment opportunities in those JSPPs that we don't get. Even in our pension plan right now, the U of T is about $5 billion. We should have cracked that in the last, depends on the market. Any day now, we'll have cracked the $5 billion mark. And you think that's a lot of money, and it is. But in the pension investment world, it's not. And so one of the things that we said in putting this together is that an important feature is a risk sharing between employees and employers that has to be explicit, it's got to be transparent, it's got to be accountable. And most plan members in the university sector have had their own direct response experience with the implicit risk, as we know that in the 2008 when we had the stock market crash, the university lost a lot of money in the pension plan, as we know. Every pension plan lost money. There was a lot of difficult times where it impacted. It wasn't so much in the pension plans, because the pension plans, the cost went up, they had to put more money in. It impacted on the budgets. And so, you know what happens when they start to cut budgets and stuff. And so, if it's not over there, it's hitting us over here. And lastly, one comment about the Ontario JSPPs is being in the sort of category of being in a distinct bunch of pension plans that are actually known around the world for their administration, their governance structures, and their investment strategies. And it's in fact on the Ontario JSPPs that we've in fact modeled the UPP. Break. So I call this the modern timeline. And I'll talk about that in a second, but I will say it's a culmination of years of discussions and negotiation amongst different groups that have changed over time. I think Colleen said, I think from labor side, I'm the last person that was from the inception in there. So the players have changed, but we have managed to move this project along and have made a lot of progress. It's been lengthy, there's been a lot of hard work, but one thing, it's always been collegial and productive. And I know that we're in here by ourselves, but we have been, surprisingly, working very closely with faculty across all the various campuses in order to do that. It'd be nice if that relationship extended to everything else, but certainly on the pension stuff, we have been working very, very closely with them. So, like I said, this is the modern one. It actually, this stuff started back in 2010, so it's been a long time working, but as we sort of moved through a couple of iterations of this project, the first mediation that we had took place in November 2015. Colleen was lucky enough to attend an entire weekend in November out by the airport, stuck in a hotel in the middle of nowhere. We had 6 different universities at the table and the faculty associations that were there. The next one, mediation, we call it the Mother's Day weekend. So it was in May 2017, it was Mother's Day. And most of us, none of us made it home for Mother's Day. We know. And so we had 3 universities. By then, what had happened was we were down to 3 universities. So 3 universities said, let's get together. We think we can make this work. We'll put it together, and whatever we create, that's going to be the plan for everybody else to come in. So there was the 3 faculty associations, there were the steelworkers, there was the ATFA was in there as well as part of the faculty associations. CUPE was in there, Unifor was, OPSU, and OSSTF. And at the end of the mediation, the majority of the participants actually arrived at an agreement to establish a sector-wide, we're calling this, it's a sector-wide JSPP, so this is open to any university in the province. And we settled on the essential framework for the new pension plan. And despite the work to reach an agreement with all the participants, unfortunately, there were some issues that couldn't be reconciled, and some groups voluntarily withdrew from the process, leaving the 3 faculty associations and the 3 steelworker locals here at U of T, at Guelph, and at Queen's. And so we continued discussions with the other unions, the other parties after the mediation. We hope to actually reach an agreement on some of the stuff. We weren't able to, but between the faculty associations and steelworker and the employers, we had a conditional written agreement that was signed in the summer 2017, and included the sign-on of a group of employees that don't have formal bargaining that we refer to as the unrepresented group. We're going to talk about, I call them the non-union, some people call them the unrepresented. We're going to talk about them in a second. So a little bit of background. So the 3 faculty associations, the steelworkers, and the 3 university administrations, we've been hard at work since last summer to solidify the details of the UPP and refine the agreement that was reached in May. And we're pleased to be able to present the UPP today. We think, and hopefully, that you'll see this sort of sector-wide initiative as extremely important to secure pension plans across all the universities in the sector for everybody that works in the universities. I will say it's been rewarding to see, I said all the different bargaining agents coming together and meeting and trying to resolve this. Like I said, we've established a relatively good relationship with the faculty associations. And I will say that even though we're not finished, we spent an enormous commitment of time and resources by each of the sponsors. You'd be shocked to see how much money has actually gone in to try to make this work, and because it takes a lot, and we still have a long road ahead of us. It's an important effort, and we're pleased to put it in front of you. And we're going to continue to invest our time and our resources in this process and work with all the employee groups towards the common goal. So the key features, so what we're going to do is sort of run through some of the key features over the next couple slides, how it'll run, what kind of pension benefits will be provided, and what the design structure, that when you see the stuff, you should actually be relatively familiar with what it actually looks like as we go through. So you can appreciate that when you're trying to put a number of different universities all together that all have different benefit structures and different sort of nuances to their pension plan, it's a complex task of trying to sort of put all of those things together. We like to think that we have done that. We've said it's going to be available to all the universities across Ontario and their employees on a voluntary basis. So much like the progress to date, expected that the bargaining agents and university administrations in other Ontario universities would come together and negotiate the timing in terms of entry into the plan. The model of the UPP, we expect it to grow. We know there's a number of universities that are waiting, that are sort of hanging in the wings, keeping updated, want to be able to join as soon as this plan starts. So the UPP is going to provide for a defined benefit pension plan, very similar to what you have now, by formula which takes into account earnings and service, just like you have now. Your past service, this is the important part. So it's one of the important parts. So your past service that you have under your current pension plan is going to get transferred into the new UPP. So the new UPP will start, let's say it starts on January 1st, 2020. We better not move the date again. It's going to be January 1st, 2020. And so what you have earned up to that transition date is what you have, you keep that. It doesn't get changed, it doesn't get reduced, it doesn't get eroded in any way. So what you've earned, if you've got 20 years in the old plan, you've got those 20 years worth of benefits. If you've got 2 months in the old plan, you get 2 months. I'm gonna be hitting the thing if it's any. So in the old plan, as of the transition date, you keep exactly what you have. So as the JSPP sort of, as the title implies, has to be jointly sponsored and jointly administered. So there's both a sponsor board and an administrative board of trustees that actually have an equal number of representation and decision-making authority by employee representatives and employer representatives. And so the responsibility of the sponsors is to make decisions about the pension plan. That replicates the sort of the collective bargaining process, because you won't be bargaining pensions anymore. Some people will be joy, because that's not very easy negotiating pensions these days. And so the sponsor board replicates the collective bargaining process. The administration board is the one that sort of runs the plan on a day-to-day operation of the plan. And so they look after the investments, processing, your pension, your termination, whatever it is that you have. And so, as we also said, because it's a jointly sponsored pension plan, so if you're familiar with all the other ones in Ontario, we're going to share the risks with the plan. We're going to share the rewards with the plan. And so what does that mean? And so the pension fund of money, the assets that's used to pay pensions and other expenses, is made up of contributions and investment income generated by those assets. The sufficiency of those assets to pay pensions and other expenses is measured, so we take a look at that, sort of those assets and liabilities every 3 years. And if they're found to be deficit, more money has to go into the plan, or the benefits have to be adjusted. There's no secret. That's the same as all the other JSPPs in the province. And so, unlike in a single employer plan, where, you know, if there's a deficit, the employer's theoretically on the hook for the deficiency funding, but in JSPPs, those risks has to be shared jointly. Now, on the flip side, you know, because we've gone through some difficult periods in pensions, on the flip side, if that triennial measure shows that there's more money than to meet the liabilities, then that's called surplus. That's a good thing. The use of that surplus, whether it's for benefit improvements or contribution holidays, has to be decided by the sponsors. So this is not the employer deciding what to do with it anymore. We jointly get to figure out what's going to happen with that. And so, like I say, the university administration doesn't do that alone. So if you look at the sponsor body first, this is the entity, like I said, that makes decisions about the design of the pension plan and sets the contribution levels. It's also established the key policies about how the UPP is funded and governed on an ongoing basis. And sort of as I mentioned a moment ago, the sponsor body will consist of an equal number of representatives from members from the university administration, and each side has one vote. So the employer, you know, if it's 6 and 6, the employer side has one block vote. They get to cast one vote. On our side, there will be 6 from labor. We cast one vote. For something to pass, it has to have 2 votes. And so we have to find a way to sort of work things out. So the employer, if they want to do one thing and we want to do something else, the plan doesn't change until we can actually come to an agreement. So it has to drive consensus. The next slide is on the Board of Trustees. So the Board of Trustees is the entity that's sort of responsible, as I said, for the day-to-day operations of the pension plan, and it actually has the statutory authority, so it's the one that's legally responsible for the administration of the plan under the Pension Benefits Act of Ontario. And so the Board of Trustees will have an equal number of university and member representatives. And here's where the unrepresented or the non-union people, here's how we have sort of addressed their concerns. So we've added one additional member to that administration board that comes from the unrepresented groups from the various universities that participate. They have to figure out amongst themselves how they actually elect that person. And although the details of like how many people sit, so we haven't decided whether it's a 6 and 6 or 3 and 3 with the unrepresented, it'll be an equal number of employer, equal number of labor, plus one additional unrepresented. We haven't figured out exactly how big that board will be, but we've actually got a working group that we're starting that process now. The one additional trustee, the one additional unrepresented person, they get a seat at the table, but they don't get a deciding vote. So if we got an equal number, and the employer says, they all say one thing, and labor all says one thing, and then we've got the unrepresented person, that unrepresented person can't make or break a tie. And so you can read between the lines what kind of vote that is. The unrepresented are big groups on the various campuses. We had a lot of discussion about their involvement, and so we've provided that seat. Labor's had some strong issues, and we sort of sawed things off, and that's so they get a seat on the administration board, but they can't make or break a tie. So the funding of the plan, this is one of the interesting things. So to start with, the funding of the deficits on a going concern basis that is in your current plan. So your current plan, all three plans, have a shortfall. So they don't have enough assets to meet all of their liabilities. And so if they walk into the UPP, we said, we're not going to share them. We're not going to start paying for half of that. That's your responsibility. And so each of the plans, when they come in, there's a process that the employer is responsible for those existing deficits of, let's call it the legacy plan of your plan that you have now. So we're not going to be responsible for that. And then after joining the UPP, we're going to have what's called the current service costs. So that's the benefits that you earn each year. And so the cost of those benefits going forward are going to be 9.1% below the YMPE and 11.3% above. And so as we all know, the YMPE is the year's maximum pensionable earnings. It's set by CPP. I know that those contributions are higher than what you pay now. I'll come back to that. We recognize, and in fact, in some of the universities, these represent some big jumps. But the employer also pays the exact same amount. And then over time, pension plans, like most pension plans, they have gains and they have losses. And so if we look at sort of from the inception date forward, if there's gains or losses, we share in those equally. And so if there's gains, we get the benefit of that gain. If there's a loss, then we have to figure out how to address it. And so we can either do that through increased contributions. Nobody likes to do that, nor nobody likes to cut benefits. And so that's why we've designed the plan, I think, to be really sustainable, hopefully. The next slide. So the accrual formula, you might recognize this. So for under the YMPE, it's 1.6% of your earnings. And then for any earnings that you have above the YMPE, it's 2% of your average annualized earnings. And so we know, even in your plan right now, the rate below the YMPE is sort of makes up for the fact that you're going to get Canada Pension Plan on those earnings. The best average earnings are not, they're the best 48 months. They don't have to be consecutive months. So any 48 months that you work, the best ones, that's what your average salary will be calculated on. So we've got an example up there of somebody that's making $75,000 a year. I know for some that may be low, for some that may be really high. For some of the faculty, it's very low. But it is, in fact, we just picked an example of somebody, and you can sort of plug in your numbers for what you want, and you can come up with sort of what your case would look like. So the retirement dates, again, the normal age at which a member can retire with an unreduced pension is age 65. That's what your present plan is. The early retirement date a member, so that you're able to retire from the university pension plan at any date after reaching age 55, and that's the Ontario Pension Benefits Act, that you were required to provide that. And so if you don't meet the eligibility requirements for an unreduced pension, I'll talk about that in a second, then your pensions are reduced by 5% each year from the start of your pension plan to age 65. The early unreduced retirement, so that's when you can retire with an unreduced pension, is based upon reaching age 62, and provided that the sum of your years in service is including the service under your old plan. So if you got 20 years under the old plan and 10 years under the new plan, so you add that service together. So as long as your age and service add up to 80 or more. Now, the next slide. We recognize that in some places this is actually a better benefit than what they have, and in some places it's not as good. We recognize that. And when somebody asks me a question about this, we'll answer this in the question and answer period, but what we did is we said people, as they sort of get a number of years in and are getting closer to retirement, have that expectation in some of the universities that was the entitlement that they were going to get, assuming that the pension plan never changed. That was the entitlement we're going to get. And so what we did is we, in fact, created what we call a grandparenting clause. And so the grandparenting clause says is that at the inception date, so let's say it starts as of January 1st, 2020, if you're age 52 or older, you get two things. You get to have your current unreduced early retirement provisions under the UPP, or you can have the calculated under your existing plan, and whichever one is better, that's the one that you get your pension calculated on. So if you're age 52 or older at the day of inception, you get to pick which unreduced early retirement provision applies to you. The indexing, we know that this is important. And so while indexing is not a required feature in law, in fact, in a lot of plans it doesn't exist. And in fact, there's a number of plans that are in the university sector that don't provide for any indexing. And so we had to actually, and we said this is an important feature, so we provide for indexing of 75% of the CPI. And then in addition to that, for the first 7 years that this plan is up and operating, any CPI that's calculated on the benefits for somebody that retires in that period of time, those benefits get protected, so they can't be reduced. After the 7 years, the indexing is dependent upon the funded status of the plan. I'd like to explain that in a little more detail. It's not in the script. When we figured out the cost of the benefits, we've got a cost envelope. The cost of this entire package has to fit within X. It's 20% of payroll. And we got to have those benefits cost each benefit costs a little bit different. As we provide different benefits, there's a cost. And so, and then we put in a safety margin in there as well, so that hopefully over time, that will leave the plan in a little bit of surplus and we won't have to increase costs or contributions. And so one of the things is that is part of the cost of that, we build in. So when you're paying your contributions, you're helping to pay for that indexing. But in a JSPP, just like the teacher's pension plan or the others, it's called conditional because if there's not enough funding, you can actually suspend the indexing in order that you don't have to cut other benefits or or increase contributions. And so that's why it's called conditional. So you'll be glad to know I'm just about finished. Sitting and listening about pensions has gotten, not easy. So there's a number of steps that actually have to be taken and conditions before we meet the UPP or to make it realized. So first of all, we got to settle all the details of the UPP, including all the documents that make up the supported pension plan, like the pension plan text, the trust agreement, the sponsorship agreement, and the number of policies to run the plan. We're actually some of those things are already in process that we're working on. The other thing that happens is that there's a very lengthy and a detailed regulatory process that's supervised by the Financial Services Commission of Ontario, and that has to be completed, and we can't start the plan until those documents are finalized. And we have met, we went down and we've met with FSCO. I will say this, is that FSCO, the regulator, has said, this isn't in the script, they have said, we want this to work, and they said, they conveyed a message, they said, the government wants this to work. And so there's a lot of support for this. And so one of the things that has to happen is that detailed notices have to go out. They got to be, the employers will be putting this together. They're starting on that already. That will give you information about the new plan, the old plan, your individual entitlements, and your rights during the process. Before those notices are sent out by the universities, each faculty association and each union that represents members that are in the pension plan have to conduct a local vote, and so we'll be conducting a ratification vote that says, do you support going into the, this isn't the wording of the ballot, but do you support going into the UPP or not? And so then there's a consent and objection process for the unrepresented employees and for the retirees. We're going to continue to provide for information updates and webinars. We've already done a webinar for a number of people. We're going to have a number of these town halls. I think I've got one every day this week. And so we're going to continue to provide education. We've got some printed material. We're going to provide for some more material. Let me see, there's also sort of a very detailed process for transferring assets. And so that's another sort of complex issue that we're continuing to work through. That's also highly supervised by the regulator. And so all of this stuff, we need the regulatory authority by FSCO in order to proceed. And so one of the reasons why we have been doing this, from the employer's perspective, I don't want to sound like the employer, but from the employer's perspective, one of the reasons for doing this is that they get exemption from solvency funding. Solvency funding is a huge problem for universities to fund on, and they're still required, if they're at a certain funded level, to fund on a solvency basis. That means their payments go way up. If their payments have to go up, the money has to come from somewhere. So one of the things is that the JSPPs in the province are all solvency exempt. And part of the provision is that if we create the UPP, we also have to have a regulation change that says that the UPP is also solvency exempt. Otherwise, the employers aren't going in. I will say that from the other side is that, and I know it's going to come up in a question when we talk about the contribution rates, we're going to end up paying half. We're going to pay half no matter which way we go. And we're going to pay for half of our pension. And if we're paying for half, we have said we ought to have half the say in this process. And so for us, that's one of the benefits for us. So as we're going through this, we've got to get a board of trustees in place. They have to build all the infrastructure for the investments, for the administration, that has to support the sort of day-to-day operational plan. We have to hire a third-party administrator. That's the job that currently your university HR departments are doing. Will now be having done by sort of an outside third-party administrator. We've got to have actual advisors, accountants, and legal advisors, and all kinds of people, and all those have to be lined up and put into place and operational before the pension plan is actually operational. And then, like I said, there's a process for Fisco to still monitor everything. And so suffice to say, starting up a new pension plan isn't like turning on a light switch. It's a necessarily complex process, and it's going to proceed. We're paying a lot of attention. We're focusing on all the detail, like it's your collective agreement. All the detail, the devil's in the detail. It's all in the writing. We're paying a lot of attention to that, and we're developing that joint governance model. And so I think this is the last slide. So where do we go? And so where are we in this process? What still needs to be done? So one of the things that happened is that we had yet another mediation session on April 7th, where we continued to hammer out some more of the details of the plan. So we still are working on the structures and operation of the two governing boards, the sponsor board and the board of trustees. So we're trying to get all of those details. I think on some of them we're very, very close. We're just sort of trying to finalize the details on the administration board through a working group. We've got some other special things. If this is not complicated enough, Queens is a very special case. It has a hybrid plan. Hybrid plans are not allowed under the Act anymore, so if you're thinking about starting one, you can't. And so they have both sort of a DC component and a defined benefit component, and it operates very differently. And so there's a number of universities, Laurier, the other names that slipped my mind, but there are a couple of plans in the province that have some interest in coming into this, and they're hybrids, and so we have to actually deal with not only Fisco, but also with the CRA on putting those in. And so there's a couple plan features that we still have to work on. The education process, like I said, is well underway. And then, like I said, the formal notice, and all the other stuff. And I think that's me temporarily finished. I'll turn it back to Colleen.
Okay, thanks very much, Alex. So I'm going to open up the